This panel is about the Global Digital Compact, so third attempt, which is probably, since the World Summit on Information Society, the most ambitious project initiated by the UN about governing the global internet and digital technologies. We have three panelists: Renata Dworn, Special Advisor of the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology; Rebecca McKinnon, Vice President of Global Advocacy of Wikimedia Foundation; and Jens Matthias Lorenz, Foreign Office, Head of the Coordination Team for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies in Foreign Relations. We will start with a statement from Renata Dworn, who will explain to us what the Global Digital Compact is about. Please, you have the floor, Renata.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Can everybody hear me? Okay, that's great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm joining you today from the WSIS Forum in Geneva, which is, of course, one of the largest multi-stakeholder discussions underway to explore digital cooperation, and indeed is one of the legacies and the drivers, together with the IGF, of the global digital cooperation. So, Jeanette, I think, presented or introduced the GDC very well. But let me just set out a couple of questions that I think I'd love to hear your thoughts and perspectives on, which is really, who cares about international digital policy? Why should we care? And what do we expect from this global digital compact? So maybe just a couple of things to get us going. The first is, where did this global digital compact idea come from? It's a proposal that came out of the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in the Common Agenda report. It had a precedent. Even before the COVID crisis, the SG had convened a high-level panel on digital cooperation. And that panel really was driven by and tried to look at three essential questions. The first, how do we mobilize cooperation around digital technologies at a time where they're playing more and more of a critical impact on our societies? Everything from how our societies organize to how they deliver services to how they function. And also it's playing a more and more critical role for developing countries in thinking about achieving their digital transformation. So digitalization is no longer one aspect of a country's development journey, but becomes a critical underpinning of the entire exercise. And that, I think, has been a motivating factor between saying 20 years on from the World Summit on the Information Society, which grappled with the question of the internet and how to achieve universal connectivity, to really say, how do we navigate a digital society and the digitalization and the processes that our societies are going through, the good and the bad? The second issue that I think really motivated the Secretary General is that digital technologies are increasingly the source of advancement, but the source of geopolitical tensions and geoeconomic power struggles in our world. And in a more fragmented society and more fragmented global order, how do we find ways to continue to work together around digital cooperation, which is, by its very essence, a transnational technology and a technology that will not respect borders? So how do we navigate that space in this more contested global environment? And the third factor was really related to the pace and the power of technology, the scale of digital transformation that is happening at the moment, the pace that we're seeing with generative artificial intelligence coming to market. How can we navigate? How can governance structures keep up with that technology and navigate the future, the benefits as well as the risks? So I think that's what drove the sense that it's time for us to re-engage, re-examine, and perhaps renew global digital cooperation for this, both to deliver on the old promises, but to consider the new challenges. COVID only accentuated that. COVID really drove the benefits, but also the harms and the very real challenges that we're dealing with. So I think that's just to give you a sense of the background. It's been a long while in the making. That first high-level panel on digital cooperation began in 2018. The Common Agenda report was 2020. Out of the considerations around this, there was a UN roadmap for digital cooperation, the SG's roadmap, which tried to look at ways to harness the UN to better address digital technologies going forward. So we've had a sort of an extended discussion before we've come to this question of a global digital compact. And that global digital compact, this digital track, is going to be a critical part of the Pact of the Future. And the discussions in September by heads of state that are really about how to renew the international system at a time of divides to really think about its future. So if I say then, just moving on to briefly, what's important or interesting or relevant in the global digital compact, I'll say that I think I'll flag four things. The first is I think it's genuinely an attempt to address long-standing issues, particularly issues around connectivity, issues about digital literacy, issues about capacity building, issues about internet access, internet shutdowns, open, safe, secure space. But as combining addressing long-standing issues with newer issues, looking forward to say, how do we think about a global framework for international cooperation around emerging technologies that is inclusive, that is legitimate, that is global, and that is participatory for all stakeholders. It's a bringing together of the older and the newer agendas and trying to find a framework for that engagement. Second, I think it's trying to renew and mobilize engagement in and around digital cooperation, but perhaps address one potential weakness of the WSIS process, which is having very clear action-oriented targets and deliverables. So you'll see when you read the Global Digital Compact, it's relatively short, it's relatively concise, and it's structured around actions that are linked directly to sustainable development goals. And to that extent, the long-standing debates of closing digital divides and using technology to accelerate development, but making that process clear with clear targets, clear accountability frameworks, and clear follow-on steps is a sense, I think, to build on perhaps some of the areas that WSIS didn't ground us in a vehicle to go forward and measure what we are, our progress. The second, I think, factor that is new to it is that it is perhaps a more sober reading of digital technologies, their benefits, but also their risks. 20 years on from the WSIS, we've seen the incredible benefits of connectivity, but we've also seen some of the harms and the risks, and these risks and harms furthered during the COVID crisis. So I think it's an attempt to say, turn some of the light on digital trust and safety, on the challenge of information integrity, and on the real potential that AI and it's the power of some of the AI-enabled information adaptation, deception, misinformation. How do we navigate that space for ourselves as societies and the impact that it can have on us, positive but also negative? So I think it's interesting and highly relevant that the Global Digital Compact is being negotiated in a year when more countries around the world are having elections than in any previous years. That gives us some sense of the relevance of thinking about the harms and tackling the harms as well as the positive. And perhaps just to flag, when WSIS was introduced first, of course, in the Geneva Declaration, Principles and Plan of Action, and then in Tunis, at that time, we didn't even have social media platforms. So we're dealing with a very different world and we need to navigate that space. Third feature I would say that is new about GDC is the primacy and the emphasis it puts on human rights. For various reasons, WSIS put a people-centered approach very central and put ethics very centrally, but it was tentative and relatively limited on human rights. The GDC establishes it as a principle, a core principle. It has a section on human rights, and it has targeted actions in relation to all people, including persons with disabilities, gender-based violence. It has quite a lot of sections on child and youth safety in relation to digital technologies. So I think that's a sort of newer element of it. And then I would add to the human rights-based dimension, it has a human-centric focus, and particularly in relation to principles around governance of AI. And then perhaps the fourth sort of significant new factor is its attempt to navigate AI. Now, if you think about generative AI came to market, it was easier to launch ChatGPT in terms of regulations than it is to bring a soft toy to the global market as a producer. And that tells us something about the gaps in thinking about governance, in fully even understanding what we need to be governing around and how we think about cooperating together. There, the GDC is drawing on the Secretary General's high-level advisory board on AI, artificial intelligence. And I'm here with you today because Amandeep, unfortunately, is with that group and can't join you tonight. But that is really looking at what sorts of principles and functions do we need at the international level regarding the governance of AI, and then what might be the forms that deliver those functions. And so the GDC is trying to adapt and reflect in those aspects in that conversation to think about a framework that would certain functions and certain forms for AI governance at the global level and at the inclusive level. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what some of those look like. And then maybe I'll just end in closing that again, building on the WIS's lessons, I think the GDC does try to say that digital cooperation can only take place through the participation of all stakeholders. And there will be a networked approach to implementation, and there will necessarily be a decentralized approach to delivery. But we do need to look at coming together, and we do need to stay harnessed at our agreed goals and ensure that momentum and progress happen. So it sets out follow-up sections and review that try to look at the roles of various bodies and entities, including the Internet Governance Forum and including some of the WIS's bodies. And it does propose that a periodic coming together at a high level, ministerial level, the heads of government level, to come together to assess where are we going with digital cooperation, what do we need to address, and how do we become more agile in responding to the pace and the power of digital technologies. Maybe I'll just note in closing one final point that I think the GDC tries to address that perhaps wasn't in the WIS's. Is there some reflection of the reality of the concentration of power and the concentration of data and the concentration of capacities of digital in the digital sphere in our world today, and how we think about inclusion in our digital world, not just in terms of participation, but also in the potential to generate value and to benefit and draw on the digital economy and its offerings. So I think that's also perhaps something that we might want to reflect on in the discussion, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Renata, thank you very much for this very clear overview of the GDC. If I may, one follow-up question. The Zero draft has been released and the first revision of the draft Zero has now also released. What would you see as the main feedback that you've got on the draft Zero? What made you publish a revision so fast?
So I should be very clear that there are two co-facilitators, one from Sweden and one from Zambia, the permanent representatives in New York of those countries, and they're the ones negotiating the GDC. The role of the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology is to support them. So first, what was the Zero draft and why was there a Rev 1 so fast? Revisions is part of the process of negotiations of any UN process. So I think you'll see a Rev 1, you'll see a Rev 2, you'll see a Rev 3, just as you're seeing Rev 1s for the Pact for the Future. I think moved quite quickly to produce a Rev 1 because we've had a lot of consultations leading up to the GDC Zero draft. And we've had expressions of broad support for, first, the structure of the draft. Second, the level of ambition. I think there's been a lot of surprise for the fact that the tone of the GDC, we've tried to make it as less UN sounding as possible, which is hard in the UN, but to make it a little bit more practical, concise, action oriented. And I think that took some people by surprise, but has been broadly welcomed. The structure has been broadly welcomed, and the 5 objectives set out: closing the digital divides and accelerating the SDGs, advancing inclusion in the digital economy, looking at an open, safe, secure digital space, thinking about data governance, and then addressing emerging technologies, including AI. Those are the 5 objectives of the GDC. They've been broadly supported. So, and then third, I would say the principles that the GDC sets out, we've had broad support for those principles. Where I think the issues are is, I think, in 3 broad areas. First, I would say the level of ambition. There, member states have differing views. Some see the importance of the digital compact being more of a statement. Other stakeholders wanted to be really ambitious and to set some really practical targets and to really drive and mobilize concerted efforts, including financing, for making that difference and for really closing the digital divides we've been talking about for 20 years, which have only gotten bigger within and between our societies. So I think there's differences in what we want from the UN and how ambitious is the appetite. A second area of debate, and I think this debate will continue, is what is the role of international cooperation on AI? And what in that question, what is the role for the UN? As you know, there are many initiatives underway about thinking about how to regulate, how to navigate, and how to govern AI to address its benefits and also address its risks. We have the G7 Hiroshima principles. There's work underway in the OECD. UNESCO released its recommendation on the ethics of AI. We have the G20 is discussing AI. We have the Bletchley Declaration by the UK, and now a series of discussions by a group of organizations, a group of member states to discuss AI safety issues in a plurilateral context. And so some say this isn't an issue that the UN should address. Others say it's too contested an issue. I think the contention and the debate up is, do we believe there's certain functions that can only take place at a global level, at an inclusive level that has the legitimacy and participation of all? If so, what are those functions? And then how do we structure the UN and how do we structure ourselves as participants to engage in that process? And that's going to be fairly contested. It's linked as well to money and reluctance to think about new bodies, new engagement at a time of fiscal constraint and at a sense of, are we trying to do too much? So I think that's going to be a key issue in the coming months to discuss. And then the third, I think, big set of issues has been around a concern that as member states discuss this, is there a risk that we're moving from what has been a multi-stakeholder process to an intergovernmental process? Is there a risk that we're falling back on multi-stakeholder commitments at a time when some member states and some communities and societies are walking back from notions of full democratic inclusion and participation? There, I think, it is the case that member states took an agreement and made a resolution that this compact would be negotiated intergovernmentally. But I think the compact is very round and robust on the absolute essential nature of multi-stakeholder engagement, not just because of the legitimacy and the value, the normative principle, but because of the actual pragmatic need. We cannot do anything in digital cooperation without multi-stakeholders, without the technical community, without the private sector, without researchers, and without civil society actors, in particular the IGF, but not limited to them. So I think that's a real driver in this area. The second dimension of that, and it's maybe translated, is sometimes a concern. If we move this to New York, are we undermining existing bodies and existing processes that are consultative and have a strong constituency and body of support? So I think that's another issue under consideration. So I think we'll be centering around AI governance, we'll be centering around data governance, and I think there will be a requirement and a need to demonstrate and show the inclusivity of the compact going forward.
Thank you so much. A lot of food for thought, and I will now ask Rebecca what is for her in the GDC. What are the main issues you see?
Well, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me through my, good, very good. Well, thank you very much for having us. And I represent the Wikimedia Foundation, which hosts Wikipedia and other volunteer-run, volunteer-governed platforms. And we have been a stakeholder in the WSIS process from the beginning. While social media may have not existed in 2005 and earlier, I was at the WSIS meeting in Tunis, and Wikipedia already existed at that time. I wasn't working for the foundation then. And I imagine we may continue to be a stakeholder in this process long after general purpose social media might no longer exist in the same way. So we're very much hoping to think towards the future. The Wikimedia communities, of course, the projects are run and governed by a community of over 250,000 volunteers all over the world, with chapters, independent chapters all around the world. And we have produced an open letter signed by many of our communities around the world and other allied organizations calling on member states to ensure that the Global Digital Compact touches on 3 areas which we're encouraged to see showing up in the compact or hinted at in different ways, and we look forward to further drafts that address these things even more directly. One is protecting and empowering communities to govern online public interest projects. So that means, you know, for example, in the current revision of the draft, there's a lot of discussion of trust and safety content moderation processes that apply to general purpose social media companies, which are not defined. But those types of processes do not apply to something like Wikipedia, which has very different governance, very different approach to trust and safety because we are decentralized and community governed. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is to make sure that the Global Digital Compact is not freezing in aspect a version of social media and platforms that may no longer, in 10 years down the road, might look very different, whose content moderation is very different. I'm not sure if my microphone is still working, but hopefully it is. So that's one thing. And also to make sure that you're defining your terms. So for example, social media, what does that mean? One concern that the Wikimedia communities have around the world is that there are a lot of nation states that pass laws governing social media, but they don't define it clearly, and these laws end up including Wikipedia when they weren't even intended to, and then they are weaponized against our communities. So we need to make sure that the compact is being very clear about what it means. Similarly, we're calling for nation states to be more explicit in the Global Digital Compact about promoting and protecting digital public goods. And we're encouraged to see that digital public goods are mentioned in the revised draft. But what does that mean in terms of open licensing, in terms of supporting a robust digital commons from which everyone everywhere can benefit, but everyone everywhere can also contribute to and govern the curation and verification and values by which the digital commons is developed. So I think some of the language in the Global Digital Compact continues to, it perhaps could benefit from a little bit more consideration that this is not just big companies and governments providing commons, providing content to the masses. It's about people all around the world co-creating the digital commons, co-governing the digital commons, co-governing and creating digital public infrastructure. It's not just the elites providing this. And so I think we would benefit in the next revision of making sure that the top-down language gets weeded out to make sure that we're really talking about co-governance, co-creation. And finally, we're also encouraged to see that in the part about artificial intelligence and machine learning, that there's discussion about ensuring that it's for the public good. We would hope to see a bit more language being very explicit that AI and machine learning need to support and empower and not replace people. That governance of these technologies and governance of the content that AI and machine learning might be helping people to create, improve, verify, translate, that the control remains in the hands of human beings, of communities, and that these communities are able to make decisions about how AI and machine learning is deployed for their own public interest benefit. So those are our basic reflections at this point.
Rebecca, thank you. I guess Renata wants to comment, but we first want to hear what our man from the Foreign Office has to say. I've been told you have a big pile of paper on your desk, and your task is to consolidate a new version of the GDC. So please give us your opinion, your view on the current version.
Let's see.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you very much. Basically, we can go along with basically everything what has been said by Renata Adwan and Rebecca McKinnon. We're very much looking forward to an ambitious global digital compact. This is not an international treaty, but this will be a political declaration signed at the end by many member states of the United Nations. And from our government view, this has been first of all a multi-stakeholder process before the negotiations started, and now it is an intergovernmental process, of course, in the United Nations. And we are dealing on several levels. First of all, in the levels of the capitals, we have to coordinate between basically all ministries. This is not a classical foreign diplomacy, because the Global Digital Compact and digitalization concerns in a horizontal way all issues of life: politics, economy, social aspects, environmental protection, innovation, climate change, connectivity, digital infrastructure, training and education, health, safety and security, protection of children and other vulnerable groups, also protection of democratic processes, labor, and also intellectual property. And therefore, you can imagine that we have to coordinate in all capitals with all other line ministries. This is our first level of diplomacy that we have to do here in Berlin. As in other countries, it is done. And then, of course, we are a member of the European Union. We want to speak with one voice in the United Nations, and therefore we also coordinate within the 27 EU member states. This is the second level. And the negotiations in the United Nations in New York are the highest, the third level. So our general approach is, as German government, we want to a forward-looking GDC with the contents that Renata Adwan and you have mentioned. It should include all countries, including countries of the Global South. And we would like to avoid a rollback in human rights, democracy and the rule of law. We think that these three fundamental values, human rights, democracy and the rule of law, are inextricably interlinked. We think you cannot have one without the two others. Human rights in a non-democratic society is hardly believable. And as you know, in the United Nations, there are different types of states, different types of government represented. So if you want to negotiate principles with a large number of countries, it's of course more difficult than negotiating just in the European Union or in the Council of Europe, where we have just negotiated the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law. So if you negotiate in a very large circle, there's always the risk to get a rollback on these values. Therefore, we would really like to see that all that is in this compact is based on the basic values, like mentioned in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also our European fundamental rights.
Renata had mentioned a few contentious issues. Perhaps you would also add some of the difficult issues you have to negotiate within the German government.
Yeah, within the German government, we managed to unite on a good position. We have one position paper on the content, so there we are basically clear now. I think we've got a good balance of human rights, economy, but also development, capacity building, fight against climate change. I think we found, and we have transmitted this position to Brussels and also to New York. And on the institutional ideas of the GDC, I think you are going to tackle them at a later time. There we have also agreed on a good position paper. But if you want, I can already mention some points on these institutional issues. We are generally in favor of developing things out of institutions which are already existing. So we would like to avoid duplication of institutions, and in saying this, we think that we are in good company. Last Friday we had a video conference with all 27 capitals of the EU member states, and we were quite happy to see that there was a relatively large consensus. But we do not want to exclude that new institutions will be created. But before creating new institutions, their added value has to be made clear. Because also the opening of new funds, we understand, of course, that money is needed for development, for capacity building, but there are already some funds also within the United Nations for which money is quite scarce. And just to open up a new fund risks creating just an empty shell, creating a competition between different funds, between people in the UN Geneva who take care about digital policy and other people in New York. So I think the solution should be an intelligent combination of these issues. Maybe we could use the IGF and the WSIS process in the follow-up of this global digital compact. Maybe we could build them in and use them in this process. Let's see what I have else. Yeah, I think I leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much. Renata, you heard the comments from Rebecca and Matthias Lorenz. Is there anything you would like to comment? Rebecca mentioned the kind of language that she found here and there, a bit top-down. And Herr Lorenz addressed the relationship between old and new organizations. And I wanted to ask you specifically how you foresee the relationship between, say, the Internet Governance Forum and the processes to be institutionalized as part of the Global Digital Compact.
Yeah, thank you very much for those very thoughtful comments. And Rebecca, indeed, you've shared a wicked Wikimedia Foundation shared its comments and has participated in the multi-stakeholder forums, and of course, the German Foreign Office, German government's views are communicated. So we've heard them and they're very thoughtful. Let me just flag a few issues. To Rebecca's point that we need to be careful not to be so top down that we close the space for platforms and for bottom up processes like the Wikimedia Foundation. I couldn't agree more with you, Rebecca. And I think it's important that we find the balance between addressing accountability of some social media platforms with thinking about facilitating, enabling, particularly local content in local languages, content that's relevant to local communities and to actors, and the freedom of expression to do that. I will note just one thing. In the many multi-stakeholder consultations that we had over the last year and a half, and in the consultations, the written consultations that were invited, that we had from a range of different, I think we had over 3,000 in total. The single repeated issue that came through from civil society groups in particular related to issues around digital trust and safety and accountability of social media platforms. So I don't think this is a concern that stems from a particular top-down government perspective only or a particular subset of states. I think it's genuinely an issue that we as all actors and in all societies are grappling with, and in particular civil society actors that both promote freedom of expression and the facilitation of online participation and content, but navigating the risks and the harms that come with that are really motivated by. So I think we can certainly work to try to find language that isn't so all, it's a concise document and it's trying to address with complex thoughts in one-line sentences. So we'll have to work to make sure that we try to reflect that it doesn't close off some of the priorities and the actions for bottom-up community-driven initiatives, which I think, and we have now language that it talks about the importance of local content and online content. The second issue that you raised, Rebecca, and I think it's a very important point, is digital public goods. I think, and this is perhaps something that has been evolved from the WSIS, again, Geneva and Tunis documents. There's, of course, did signal e-government, but there's a much more meatier section around digital public goods and digital public services as ways of offering services at scale to societies and allowing people to become producers and not just consumers, and value generators, not just value contributors in the digital space. We have flagged in particular the value of open source goods, softwares, models, platforms for the facilitation of inclusion in that space for individuals, communities, and countries and actors as a whole. And I think this is a strong section and a new section and an exciting section. What I think the challenge will be in that, and this brings me to Matthias Lorenz's points around human rights. We also flag that digital public goods and digital public infrastructure will only achieve their goals of facilitating inclusion and facilitating participation, meaningful participation, if they come with protections, privacy, security, and what we're calling universal safeguards. And those include rights respecting safeguards. And so maybe I think to come to the EU point about human rights, I think it's very important to reflect human rights, and it is there as a principle. And as I said, we see that as a step forward from the WSIS in its explicitness. It's there in a key section that addresses human rights. But we also feel that we can pursue human rights very practically through focus on issues around safeguards, around arrangements, agreed standards and protections around data governance, for example. So in other words, we can embed human rights, values, norms, and protections in particular areas that we can take forward in the GDC. And I think this is very important. So it means that human rights is mainstreamed across the direction. So I think I would only add to the point on the importance of digital public goods that this is also a critical dimension about the quality of those goods and the protections that they must come with, including around privacy. So I would flag that. In the other, perhaps just 2 points that I would flag right now on new technologies. I think Matthias said something very interesting when he was describing the process of Germany coming to a common national position before you went to your EU positions and colleagues. And this is, I think, for me, a fundamental difference in the global discussions right now on digital cooperation compared to perhaps 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we were talking a lot about physical infrastructure. We were talking about connectivity. We were talking about ICT ministries. We were talking about sort of a physically driven activity to connect people. Now, of course, we weren't limited. And of course, issues around education and services were flagged in the highlight, but the focus was there. And even as I sit here in WSIS today, one of the key measurements of success still is how many people are connected online. We're coming later to the questions about, well, what's the quality of that connection? What's it enabling? How affordable is it? And so on and so forth. So I think we really want to think about the fact that digital cooperation is now a whole of government approach. And just as Matthias said, it involves so many ministries now, no longer any one single ministry. That's how we're trying to approach it at the global level. And that's challenging because then there's many different perspectives and there's many different priorities and orientations. And I would argue that that's actually making frameworks such as the Global Digital Compact even more important because we have to have agreement on some of the key foundations if so many of us are going to be involved in the digital space and if digitalization and digital transformation is genuinely and truly a whole of government, a whole of society activity. Jens mentioned some concerns around some new institutions. And let me be very precise about what those are being proposed. There's a limited set of new proposals around new structures. One is the idea of a scientific panel on AI that would provide a horizon scanning perspective on AI that would be global, that would be inclusive. Some have echoed the model of the panel on climate change to try to support scientific consensus at a global level on AI. And to also allow countries that may not otherwise have the capacity and societies that may not have all of those capacities access to learning, knowledge, trends in that way. The second proposal that's on the table is for an annual dialogue between those representatives in countries responsible and charged for thinking about the development of governance approaches on AI. And that's really with an attempt to try to manage how we think about interoperability, how we think about having an AI governance that is truly, I don't want to use the word harmonized, but compatible, and that can be interoperable. That's necessary for government, for private sector, and that's necessary in order for us to be able to use international data sets in order to be able to generate value from AI capacities. And the third sort of proposal around that's new around the AI space is for the idea of a global fund on AI for development. And some have raised this question of, won't this interfere with existing UN funds for the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular the digital window around the SDGs? I think the rationale for this fund is threefold. One, most of the SDG fund, and indeed all of the SDG fund, is focused on helping countries on their national transformation journeys, their digital transformation journeys, and in their plans and projects to achieve the SDGs and to progress them. The idea of a global AI fund is to look at trying to support collaborations between societies at the country level, at city levels, at interactive sectoral levels, like civil society engagements, to try to drive that level of cooperation, because AI is by definition transnational. And the level of resources required to build that capacity, to build that compute capacity, to build the large data sets to train large language models is going to be not transnational. So how do we facilitate that level of collaboration? And that isn't something that the SDG Fund right now does. It's nationally focused. So it's trying to look at AI Fund. It's also trying to make sure that the AI investments that will be required do not crowd out existing digital transformations because they are resource intensive. And if you look at some of the cost estimates that we've seen for training large language models, or we look at some of the investments that companies like Microsoft have made in generative AI models in the last 18 months, these are at a scale that is way beyond what most, including my own country, small countries can afford. So I think it's really trying to look at how we think and facilitate that. And third, we would, from the discussions that the co-facilitators have had with the AI board and with others, there is a sense of potential interest in the private sector to contribute to such a fund. So I think it's precisely in order to protect existing funds and not to create and drain them that there's this proposal. But it's obviously going to be for member states to decide how we go on that. There are also 2 other proposals for new institutions, but I'm happy to come back to that for follow-up and review. The office that I work in right now, as well as a follow-up mechanism. But I'll turn over for now.
Thank you, Renata. One further question before we open the floor to the audience. Concerning the IGF, what specific role do you see for the IGF, which has taken up quite a few of the issues mentioned in the GDC and has discussed them over the last years? What specific role would you see for the IGF within the follow-up processes of the GDC?
Yeah. So the GDC is, let me just flag 2 points. One, when the SG initiated the GDC, the internet governance, the critical need to keep it whole, unfragmented, interoperable was uppermost in the SG's mind. And so in that, the feature of internet governance and its global resource value and seeing it as truly a global resource that must be protected and shared and supported is very much in the GDC. The IGF is flagged there as the critical multi-stakeholder forum for public policy discussions on issues related to the internet. That's its original mandate. It has interpreted that mandate in a broad way and discusses many other issues related not only to the internet and its health, but to many other issues related to digital and emerging technologies. And that's obviously within its purview to do that and to the communities that engage in that body. In terms of follow-up, the proposal that's in the Rev 1, the first revision of the GDC, is for a role for the IGF in supporting follow-up to the GDC and in supporting implementation. And I think it sees it particularly in 3 areas. One, really trying to communicate to its over 155 regional and national networks, as well as through the annual IGF forum, communicating the GDC, serving as an amplifier for what's in the GDC, where is the international digital cooperation going, and how can the IGF contribute? So it's an important amplifier, knowledge builder, enhancer. Second, we see the IGF as potentially playing a critical role in really taking forward some of the actions, including but not limited to Objective 3, how to maintain an open, safe, secure digital space, issues around human rights, issues around digital safety, issues around information integrity, and some of those issues that are at the heart of the internet and the questions around the internet, as well as this unfragmented, this whole aspect of the internet. So that's areas where we would see the IGF having a particularly huge contribution to play. And the third, which is in the follow-up proposals, is the idea that the IGF might constitute, should it wish, and it's an invitation, an annual policy track on GDC, so that every time it comes into its annual discussions on the GDC, it has a standing item to discuss how is the GDC going, where are we looking at implementation, and if the member states agree to periodically come back at a high level, at a ministerial level, the IGF would be participant in that process, engage in that process, and contribute its assessment of where are the gaps, where are the challenges, and where are the opportunities for digital cooperation. I would just finally flag, I see the national and the regional IGFs as critical in taking forward the GDF at national level, and that's ultimately where the differences are going to be made. So I would hope that the national IGFs would see a role for themselves intersessionally in supporting that.
Thank you. Very interesting. Now, unless you have something really urgent, I would open to the floor. You, yeah?
Shortly answer. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, I go along with most of the things which have been said. On the scientific panel, Germany is really open to build such a scientific panel. It must include the Global South, be transparent, and if possible, build on existing structures. Also, we are very much along with you in encouraging development of international partnerships of AI capacity building. Of course, developing AI is extremely expensive. Up to now, this is financed by big tech companies, but I honestly don't believe that the United Nations organization could compete with big tech companies in financing themselves large language models development.
The power issue.
The power issue. I mean, we can, of course, create a new fund, and we do not want to have competition. If we find money for a new fund, then that's fine. We're just a little bit skeptical if you find money for a new fund, at least not in our government, because our finance minister has said quite clearly that given the extreme budget constraints of minus several dozens of billions of euro per year, we cannot calculate with more money, rather less.
Yeah.
You can, of course, open another fund, especially for private donors, and then you have the problem: who gives money also would like to determine what shall be done with this money. So, yeah, that's a basic problem. And implementation map, we're very fine with this. Should reference on existing mechanisms, and annual report on GDC is also basically a good idea if it builds up on existing structures. Thanks.
Rebecca?
Yeah, speaking of money and power and the Internet Governance Forum, Wikimedia Foundation and our communities are very enthusiastic about engaging in the multi-stakeholder conversations for implementation, for capacity building, for digital literacy. We believe that both the foundation and the Wikimedia global communities have much to add and participate. However, we're concerned about the lack of resources for the Internet Governance Forum, which results in the forum at the global level being hosted only by governments that want to pay for it, but where our own safety and security, or as you call it, universal safeguards, we do not feel safe and therefore cannot participate.
Thank you. Now, are there questions in the audience? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Rebecca, it's great to see you. Thanks for really excellent points. My
Could you
question
please
is about
introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Arzu Gebula. I'm a journalist. So my question is about the UN. We've been in spaces that have been encouraging UN to be more proactive, recommending this institution to engage and develop policies that are actually effective. So my concern about this UN involvement in all of this conversation is how effective actually this is going to be. Because we've seen this, I've been to so many IGFs where governments come together, civil society is there, but you know, it's not having an impact. So how really effective it's going to be this time around? Thank you.
Is that question directed to someone, to all of them? Then
whoever wants to take
Then
that.
let's collect another question.
Yes, maybe this question is related in the sense that we might have
Could you introduce yourself?
What?
Could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is my name is Karl Steinacker from the International Civil Society Center here in Berlin. And I wonder whether we discussed the wrong event or the wrong animal or the wrong structure. Because there are negotiations going on between countries on e-commerce. It's in the context of the World Trade Organization. And it seems to me that while the Digital Compact is, a political statement, the outcome of the WTO negotiations would be a convention. And that is much more binding than any political statement. And, and a lot of issues, political issues, are actually wrapped into these discussions about the e-commerce convention.
Okay, Renata, quick answer to these two questions so that the others also have a chance to comment.
Yeah, thanks for the question on the UN. I'm a bit tempted to give you the answer that Churchill did about democracy. It's terrible, but have you got a better option? And what I mean by that is there's a trade-off in the UN between participation and inclusivity, legitimacy and effectiveness. And yes, it is the case that there are some real questions about impact, and I certainly agree with you. But I think there's also some real challenges about outside the UN means inclusivity issues, participation issues, and legitimacy issues. So I would say one thing that GDC has tried to do is first set some targets that weren't set perhaps before in some digital technology cooperation frameworks before. And those targets may not stay, but they offer us a lodestar of saying, how could we measure effectiveness? And then the same bodies that are decentralized and networked, the same WSIS bodies, the same IGFs will be responsible for delivery at the national level. Ultimately, the UN rarely delivers itself as an entity. It facilitates a framework that national, regional, and other deliveries takes place. On the question, is the GD a political statement and non-binding, and are other instruments much more powerful? Absolutely. But we need, again, this roadmap to set us on a direction. And I think we need a roadmap, particularly in areas that are by definition decentralized and need to take place looking, as you exactly said, in a WTO, in a UNODC, in in a WIPO convention, in an ITU. And if those are going to take place, they need to at least be coherent and at least be interoperable. And that's something we hear strongly from civil society and private sector. So can the GDC provide the framework for that, even if non-binding, for those more detailed implementation tools? That's, I think, the whole.
Thank you, Renata. Rebecca.
Yeah. Why does the Wikimedia Foundation and the Wikimedia communities, why do we engage in this? To speak to your question, because even if governments don't all adhere to it, it's a standard to which we can hold them and hold them accountable. Just like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is anybody adhering to it? Not particularly, but are we better off because we can hold that up as a standard? Yes. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is now soft law that's being turned into hard law in some countries. So we see how these types of standards and agreements, if they have broad legitimacy, can make a difference over time. So that's why we participate. Speaking of other UN processes and organizations, we have some concerns with some of the positions the United States is taking in the WTO related to interoperability of the free flow of information on the internet. And we're also concerned, we finally joined the Economic and Social Council as a non-governmental observer after one nation state trying to block us for many years. We're still being blocked from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, because of one member state's blockage, which is very much preventing us from having the contribution that all stakeholders should be able to make in UN processes.
Okay. Hello, Lorenz. You don't have to say, okay. Then I have 30 seconds left for saying thank you. I would think a good progress would be that the emphasis on human rights also concerns the private sector, specifically in the field of AI. And if the global digital Compact took on board the Net Mundial +10 principles on multi-stakeholder participation. So thank you very much for this very interesting panel with very good contributions.
Thank you.